I'm sure it's the peeve of every night vision nerd and builder out there that people say, I want white phosphorus tubes. If I were to put white phosphorus in your night vision device, you'd probably end up with not much of your head left. And if you ever watched the news or played Spec Ops: The Line, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyways, we're going to get into our tubes today. So in this one, we have a green phosphor Photonis Echo tube. And in this one, we have a white phosphor tube. And we're going to see how well these tubes stack up against each other. Before we get into that, we're going to get into a little bit of history between the two different phosphors. Originally, as most of you know, night vision was done in green phosphor. And to understand why, we have to understand a little bit about the human eye. The human eye is made up of two different visual cells. One of them is going to be rods, and one of them is going to be cones. So rods work in low light environments. They see the difference between light and shadow, so they don't really work with colors. And cones, conversely, don't really work well in low light environments, but they see the difference in colors. And for some evolutionary reason, probably something to do with gathering vegetables or something like that, biologists, comment down below if you know more about this. The human eye sees the most shades of green. So we see the difference between light green and dark green, and we see lots of greens in between. White phosphor is a bit of a newer adaptation. It was, invented quite a long time ago, actually, in the late 20th century, but it is a newer adaptation probably within the last decade or so. Now, some people claim that white phosphor offers improved contrast because the image, especially when it gets darker, goes from that bluish shade that you see over here to more of a neutral black and white shade. And that allegedly activates more rods in your eye. So you can see that difference in contrast a bit more in that more black and white image. For some people as well, the white phosphor induces less eye strain, so you can wear it longer without it fatiguing your eyes. Green phosphor, on the other hand, does have some advantages as well. Like I said earlier, you can see more shades of green than any other color. As well, if you're going to be flipping your night vision up to check what's around you, green phosphor apparently also has less of a harsh effect. You don't lose your natural night vision. Your eyes adjust more quickly to the surrounding natural ambient light conditions than white phosphor does. Now, I don't know how true this all is. A lot of this is very hard to measure. It's very hard to measure someone's preference for color. I'm sure the insurance companies are very good at doing it for cars, but for night vision, it's very hard to do. There are a lot of studies that show that the raw performance difference between green and white is mostly preference. However, because the preference ends up being towards less eye strain and more contrast, white phosphor wins, where green phosphor has kind of fallen a little bit out of vogue. Now, this does have an actual very tangible advantage when it comes to you, the end user, and you as most likely a civilian watching this video. Green phosphor is cheaper for the specs. So if you were to have, let's say, a 2000 photon green phos unit and a 2000 photon white phos unit, you're probably going to be saving a few $100s on the green phos unit. And here at CHS, we like to think of night vision as a pretty whole package. So you're not just, buying the best unit ever and holding it to your face and walking around like that. You're going to be buying that unit with mount, an arm, accessories for your rifle, optics, whatever, or just having a bit more money in your pocket for whatever life throws at you. However, when it comes to Photonis tubes, there's actually a really important spec difference we're going to look at with green phosphor tubes, and I'm going to pull out that spec sheet right now below me. Most of the minimum and maximum specs for the Echoes are going to be the same whether they're green or white. However, the biggest difference is going to actually be the gain spec, and gain is the measurement of how well the night vision device actually intensifies the light. So it is a really important spec. The higher the gain, the better the device in most scenarios, assuming that your device has a good SNR too that can handle that gain. So for the white phosphor, the minimum spec is 8,000, whereas the green phosphor has a minimum spec of 9,000. So if you get the worst green Photonis Echo tube and the worst white Photonis Echo tube, you're actually going to get higher gain with the green phosphor tube in its minimum spec. The maximum spec is also higher for the green tube versus the white tube. For the white tube, the maximum spec is going to be 12,000 gain, and for the green tube, it's going to be 15,000 gain. So pretty significant difference. And this can actually be seen in the averages of the tubes that we've been getting lately. On average, most of the Photonis tubes in white phosphor that we get, the Echoes at least, not any of the fancy ones, but the Echoes, are going to be ranging between 9 and 10,000, which is pretty good. The green tubes are ranging usually between 11,000 to the high 12,000s, which is a 2 to 3,000 gain difference, which, we're going to see in our testing if that actually plays into a significant result. If in our test it shows that the green Photonis tubes can actually see more in low light conditions, like being in a canopied forest or being indoors, that actually leads more credence to the green tube than just being the cheaper, more budget-friendly, and more efficient alternative. Before we get into the testing video, let's go over our testing parameters, because that's super important. Our testing rig is going to be the same one we use for NNVT. So this is a Sony A7 III. Now, like I said before, it doesn't have the fancy 10-bit color like the S3 that we're using to film this video, but because the images are monochromatic, that color doesn't really matter. What it does have is a ginormous sensor, especially compared to phones, and it has the ability to manually dial the settings, which we can keep consistent between our devices. I'm going to post the settings down here below. One important one is going to be the white balance, which we can lock and keep consistent. Now, take into account as well, the camera is not going to see things exactly the same way your eye does. They both work very differently. In fact, I would say under almost all cases, because cameras have a lot of optical elements to them, like lenses and whatever, the nod is going to look maybe 10 to 20% better in your eye than it does in camera, but this is the best we got. Now we're going to get into our test devices. So these are going to be built with Nocturne Industries Tantos with mil-spec Carson front and rear lenses. That way you get a very consistent image across the board and there's no different variables other than the tubes themselves. So for our first device here, this is going to be our White Phosphor control device with an echo tube in it. It's going to have a FOM of 1,887. It's going to have a gain of 9,348 with a resolution of 67, an EBI of 0.08, which is 0.8 for a US conversion, and an SNR of 28.17. A pretty nice tube and a very nice echo in all respects. For our green phosphor tube, it's going to be this one. Again, same thing, Tanto, mil-spec front and rear lenses. And this guy is going to have a FOM of 1,869, nice. It's going to have a gain of 12,935, so that's significantly higher than the white phosphor tube. It's going to have a resolution of 70. It's going to have an EBI of 0.07, which converted to US is 0.7, low EBI. It's going to have an SNR of 26.7. So both tubes are relatively similar. There are some differences between each spec, but the biggest difference is going to obviously be that gain spec that we're looking at. We're going to do a few tests here. The first few tests we're going to do, we're going to load it up into the Hoffman machine, which is a much more laboratory and clinical test. It allows us to precisely control the amount of light going in the device, and we're going to go look at it under this line chart, which is basically like a eye chart for nods. Another test that we're going to do that we did not do with the NNVT test, most of you have probably seen, is going to be putting it on the Hoffman and seeing what gain the Hoffman outputs. Now the Hoffman does a very different gain test than the gain listed over here, so it's not the same number, it's going to be a lot lower. It's not even rated at the same thing, but what the number gets you is a relative overall gain for the device. I do expect the green phos tube, because the gain is significantly higher, to have a higher gain on the Hoffman, which we're going to see first right now. So we've connected the white phosphor tube first to our Hoffman machine here, and with the gain probe it's stabilizing. It's going to average at about 4,500. We're going to put that big number there at the end. What the Hoffman does is it doesn't take the same number as the spec sheet. It's an overall system-wide reading that the Hoffman scores. We're putting the green phosphor tube in now, and the gain reads significantly higher. We find that most green phosphor tubes score between 5,000 to 6,000, whereas most white phosphor tubes score between 3 and 4. This is Photonis echoes. In this case, we're averaging here at about 5,360. This percent difference ends up being around 17.4%, which is quite significant, but let's see if this translates into performance when we put these in our line chart test. So the Hoffman test, like I said earlier, is like an eye chart for your nods. What we're looking for is how well the tubes can resolve details as the light level decreases. We're going to start here with 1.5 millifoot Lamberts, which is the amount of light the Hoffman lets in, and we're going to gradually lower it. Just like our NNVT test, the lower the light gets, the more noise or scintillation the tube is going to produce as it struggles to intensify the image. If you have no light, you can't intensify anything. However, what we're looking for is the differences in levels of intensification and the differences in the levels of details we can see between the green and the white tubes. From this test, in the beginning, I was pretty skeptical to see if the green tube would actually perform better, but the end results surprised me quite a bit. In the beginning parts of the test, before we get into the 0.001, etc. range, they perform quite similarly. It's actually very hard to tell the difference, but as the light levels drop, you're going to actually see that higher gain of the green tube kick in, even though it has slightly lower SNR, which is a pretty huge consideration for extremely low light environments. Both tubes exhibit really good contrast because they have Photonis's really great contrast values, but here we can see the big difference between the green and the white tube. If you look at the middle square, there are little circles in the middle. For the white tube, you can basically see that the circles are starting to disappear, whereas the green tube, you can still see them quite clearly, as well as some numbers in the 5 and all of the 4s. When we drop down to 0.05 millifoot lamberts, you can see that we lose all of the detail in the circles for the white image, but the green image still maintains some details. When we drop down to 0.03, now we can really see the green tube starting to shine quite a bit more than the white phosphor tube. The image still is produced. We can still see a lot of all the numbers, whereas the white phosphor tube is starting to struggle at the corners of the image. And as we get down to 0.01, the green phosphor tube, we can still see a very faint outline of the crosshair and the square, whereas we are just down to scintillation and noise within the white phosphor tube. Pretty surprising results. I didn't expect this to happen, but it goes to show that that bit of gain does actually make a performance difference in a lab setting. But enough with that. Not everybody has a Hoffman here. We're very lucky to have one that works for us so we can see how these tubes perform. Let's see how these tubes perform in a real world environment. So we're going to start here with our highlight test, and we're going to move on to darker environments, just like the NVT video. So in this case, both images have really great auto gating. You can see they maintain resolution in highlight tests. Photonis does well in mixed lighting environments, no surprise there. However, what we're looking at is differences in gain. As you can see, the white image is a lot less harsh than the green image in this case with these camera settings. Of course, your eye will correct for that. These cameras are using a fixed setting. With that, more exposure in that brighter image, you're going to get a bit of blown out highlights. That's kind of a given. But in this case, the gain isn't all wasted just for being super bright and a little harsher. In some cases, like the condos over here, you can actually see a better differentiation between the front and the rear buildings, whereas in the white image, it's a lot harder to tell if that top structure is part of the rear condo or part of the front. The green one, it's much easier to tell the values of that structure and see it is part of that front building. So gain can be useful in urban settings. We went back into our low light testing area, but we found that it was a lot brighter because the fall has made a lot of the canopy disappear and it was a full moon. But we still wanted to get some footage anyway since we were out here on the trail to compare the two images. In this case, I do think the white phosphor image performs better because of the harsh moonlight. It's actually quite bright, almost as bright as the city in this case. The green phosphor image is no slouch. It's not any worse. I don't feel like I see any less. It's just a bit harsher, a bit brighter. But it does also come with a bit more things like detail. I do see a little bit more detail in the leaves in the back versus the white, but on the white I do see a bit more contrast. Now, this is a true low light test. We went to a very heavily forested area with still a lot of canopy and tree cover, and we did a interesting test where we had some guys walk on a trail. With the white phosphor image, you can see the image here is quite a bit darker, and you do lose some details, so just under the log, you can't really see what's there, whereas in the green image, you see a little bit more of the branches, and you also see more of a differentiation between the trees, I believe, in the green image, whereas in the white image, some of them just looks like noisy blobs, whereas in the green image, you can see that the front trees are made up of different branches a lot easier. But the humans walking in the background are still very noticeable in both images. In this case, I would say it's very much up to your personal preference. If you want a less harsh image, you go with the white. But if you do care about intensification, if you need to see every detail in the woods, the green image will suit you a little better. So for those of you who are in rural environments and looking to save a little bit of money, you're not losing on performance by going to a green tube. Yes, you do lose out on certain things, but in some ways you'll gain as well with Photonis. You will actually get a little bit more details in some parts of the image, as you can see, like I said earlier, with the area around the log, some of the trees in the front, and the parts where the sun really does not shine. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this last test because we wanted to see the difference in performance in extremely low light environments. And this is a very dark part of the forest on that same night. There's basically no moon, there's quite a few clouds in the sky, and there's a lot of tree cover in this area, as you can see. The white image on initial look might look a little better because it's that kind of very calming, pleasing white, whereas the green image is very harsh. However, if we look at the details in the image, you can actually see the green image, because of that little bit more gain, produces a bit more details. And this can be seen in the rear parts of the forest where the contrast is a lot stronger. You can see where that canopy breaks into the path over there, whereas the white image almost looks like an NVT image. Of course, if you're using an NVT tube, this would look considerably worse. And in the front, where you can see the trees of the green image are very clearly defined. You see the striations, the branches in the foreground, whereas in the white image, it's a little bit lost to the noise. I actually do prefer the green image in this case quite strongly because of that contrast, because that contrast does allow you to see greater details and greater differentiation between light and dark areas of the image. And what I did here was I made the images black and white. I turned down the saturation all the way in the video, so now you can see without the different biases for white or green in your eyes, which image is better. And I'll kind of let it do the talking here. Take a look at the contrast. That's where you're going to see the biggest difference. So we just got back from that round of testing, which is why I got the jacket on. But green versus white phosphor, and like any part of choosing a tube, green versus white phosphor is only one aspect. We don't look at simply one spec or one aspect of the tube to pick what we want. I would suggest looking at the context of how you're going to use your tube and the context of your budget. If you want my opinion, for me, I still prefer white phosphor tubes because I mostly work in environments with supplemental lighting. All the fun I have with nods is in areas where I have another light, or it doesn't really matter if I turn on an IR light if it gets really dark. However, if you are in a lot of rural environments, if you're in the woods a lot, or if you need green phosphor just to save a bit of money, then you're not really losing out on anything performance related to green. It's simply just a very different characteristic of the tube. As you can see from our testing, and I was also surprised by this, when we went into the forest, into the deep dark areas, the green phos actually performed a little better. And that little bit of performance allowed me to see slightly more things when it came down to extreme low light areas. All of our green phosphor tubes that we sell at Cold Harbor will come with a free amber filter you can screw on the rear. What that amber filter does is it reduces the amount of backsplash it puts on your helmet if that's something important for you for an operational consideration. And it also reduces a bit of that harshness of the green image, turning it more into a yellowish, lighter green. So you can put that on if you want, or you can just leave it to the side. It's included with all of our green phos units. And with that, that's going to be it for our green versus white phosphor video. Remember, that's phosphor, not phosphorus. And if you need any help with nods, you know where to go. Have fun with these things, everybody. Take it easy.